So welcome everyone. This is the CHARRM group's Living Shorelines in Our Region Biology and Basics webinar. So this session will be recorded. We'll place it in the CHARRM Teams folder and we'll use it as a future resource for us as we go through our parking lot items in the fall and winter. We may have a better repository for our recordings and resources in the future. More to come on that at a future meeting. But for today, for new folks joining, I just wanted to remind everyone that CHARRM is an acronym for the Coastal Habitat and Aquatic Resource Research and Monitoring Work Group. So it's a bunch of us from New Jersey and Delaware Bay. We even have some Chesapeake Bay folks here. And our objective is to facilitate communication, but also think about some of the research gaps that are hindering work or could maybe help work be more ecologically successful. One deliverable we hope to come from this group will be developing research and monitoring proposals for funding, since that seems to be a gap. There's a lot of implementation funding out there, but not a lot of money for research and monitoring. So maybe we can work together to be more competitive for some of that funding. We meet monthly and our meetings include selected webinar series. That's what we're going to be doing this summer. We have discussions, we have updates, we share information, resources, and collaboration. So let's talk about why we are here. So we know that we needed to identify some outstanding research questions. To figure out what those were, we got everyone together and started a few listening sessions. We created jam boards. We put topics that we wanted to delve more into with data and resources and research into that jam board. And we figured out a couple things. One, there's a lot of need out there, but the other thing is that this is an evolving field. And so we thought it would be great to take a step back, take stock of what's been done, what tools and resources and literature are existing so that we can move forward productively. So that's why we have this summer restoration webinar series on living shorelines, and then our next one will be on marsh restoration. I think more and more we're understanding that the two are interlinked, but for the purposes of some of the topics that came out through those listening sessions, we divided them up. So that's why we're here. So today we will learn the basics and the latest in the field of shoreline protection from the experts that we have speaking to us today. These experts will provide us an excellent primer on living shorelines basics, resources, research, and more. So thank you three so much for coming to share your knowledge with us. CHARRMers, I just wanted to say for you that as we go through today's webinar, maybe some parking items for this group, maybe start inventorying available resources to help us be productive in our future conversations, and then come up with your own questions. And then after we hear from our experts, we'll have time for questions, and then we'll engage in a panel discussion about living shorelines. So feel free to start writing your questions in the chat as we move along. And then if at the end, if you raise your hand, I'll try to call on people in order. So first, please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Dr. Rob Isdell. He is an assistant research scientist at the Center for Coastal Resources Management at Virginia Institute of Marine Science, and he'll be sharing his expertise from Chesapeake Bay, resources developed by the CCRM, and provide us a primer on the intertidal ecology and impacts of shoreline modification. So thank you so much for speaking with us today, Rob. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for the invitation to come up and talk to you guys virtually. But yeah, so I'll go ahead and share my screen. That look good?
Looks great. Thanks, Rob.
Great. Yeah. So I got asked by Danielle to come up and share some of the information that we have down here in the Chesapeake Bay, some of the work that we're doing at the Center for Coastal Resources Management with you all. I'm going to set the bar today, keep it nice and low so you know it's only up from here, especially with the speakers that are following me. But I will do my best, and yeah, please, any questions, let me know at the end during the session, or follow up with me after the talk. So yeah, Danielle asked me to talk about intertidal ecology, impacts of shoreline modifications, basically condense a course that I've taught down into about 10, 15 minutes, and then talk a little bit more about some living shoreline research. And so I'll just go ahead and jump in. I think most of you probably already are very familiar with the intertidal, but just as a refresher, the intertidal around the mid-Atlantic can be broken into unvegetated and vegetated intertidal. Unvegetated, you've typically got intertidal mudflats or a beach or even kind of human development. Whereas for vegetated, we're really talking about salt marshes. And salt marshes are the most productive intertidal habitat in the mid-Atlantic for sure. And so I'm going to really focus a lot on them. So the salt marsh exists within a narrow tidal envelope. So we're talking about everything from kind of that spring high water line, the mean higher high water, down to approximately mean water is where the marsh stops more or less. And then the intertidal continues down to the mean low water line. And in between there, you get zonation within a salt marsh. So you've got your Spartina alterniflora down at the front end. And then typically you move back into Spartina patens, Distichus, different plants depending on where you are throughout the mid-Atlantic. But embedded within that system, you've got a variety of species, everything from obviously the plants, but then you've got rib mussels that live in there and a host of other species. So these salt marshes are particularly important for the species that they host, everything from crustaceans and terrestrial invertebrates, a number of shorebirds, wading birds, even songbirds rely on these salt marshes. Extensive habitat for fish. Things like mummichugs are your resident species, but there's also a number of other species, things like lots of juveniles use this as nursery habitat. You've got reptiles that use these habitats, things like the diamondback terrapin pictured here, but also a number of snakes and other reptiles. And of course, you've got the in-fauna, things like rib mussels throughout the region as well. These salt marshes are particularly important. So this intertidal zone is really important for the ecosystem services that it provides. Salt marshes, we know that they are fantastic at reducing erosion and storm surge for the areas upland of those locations. You've got lots and lots of nutrient removal. So as water runs off of the upland, all of the nutrients that are tied up within that runoff, as it passes over the marsh, those marshes are able to remove a huge amount of the nutrients that are coming off the uplands. These are fantastic sources for recreation. All the fish that want to eat the little fish that live in the marshes come around, and so they're a great source for recreation, whether that's fishing or kayaking. These are great places to be. And they're providing essential habitat for several species. Things like the salt marsh sparrow rely on salt marshes in order to function. And so one of the other things that we're seeing too, that's particularly of interest, is that so much research recently has kind of focused, and not just recently, but over the past probably decades, has focused on how important these subtidal habitats, things like seagrass and everything, are. And there's been an acknowledgement that marshes are important, but it's not been quite clear exactly how important. And so this is a fairly recent paper that just came out that actually points to just how important these systems are, particularly for things like blue crabs. And so what they found were things that so juvenile blue crab abundance increased with the availability of salt marsh habitat relative to geographic area. And then seagrass meadows really weren't associated with high juvenile crab abundance. It's a pretty cool paper. Go check it out. But it kind of broke that long-held assumption that seagrass meadows are the thing for blue crabs. And what we're really seeing is that the nursery habitat that these marshes are providing, particularly the edge habitat here, is absolutely essential for these species. And so acknowledging how important, not just the amount of area of these marshes, but how that marsh is configured and the availability of that edge habitat throughout the system is particularly important too. So marshes are great. I think a lot of us, if not all of us, can agree on that, but they're certainly not particularly stable in a environment where sea levels are rising rapidly. So marshes exist within this narrow tidal band. As sea level rises, their options are to accrete and or migrate inland. Because right now, we're seeing a whole lot of erosion. So this is just one example from Virginia's eastern shore, where from 1994 to 2015, a substantial amount of erosion occurred within this particular salt marsh. But that's likely to accelerate as sea level rise is accelerating. A lot of the places, the Chesapeake Bay is relatively similar to the Delaware Bay, but these are low sediment areas. There's just not enough sediment in the water to allow these marshes to vertically accrete fast enough to keep up with sea level rise. And so the option really is the ability to migrate landward. That's how we're going to maintain aerial extent. So when it comes to protecting marshes and protecting shorelines and reducing erosion, there have been a variety of techniques developed over the years. Historically, a lot of this has focused on gray infrastructure, things like revetment, bulkhead, and seawalls. And yeah, they do a fantastic job of stopping erosion. They do their job. But if that's the only thing that you value, sure, that might be useful. But what we're really coming to realize is that these gray techniques just do not support the ecosystem the way that they're supposed to. And so other techniques have been developed to try and address that. So some of the ways that these gray infrastructure, these things like primarily bulkhead and revetment is what we've looked at, but ways in which they come up lacking. So we know that they are responsible for habitat loss and fragmentation. Forest and wetlands are both lost due to these techniques, whether that's a person just wanted to armor their shoreline because they thought it was prettier, and so they impacted the marsh. We know that they dramatically alter the sediment supply and transportation. We see increased scouring and turbidity in front of these systems. So you put a wall in for bulkhead, and as those waves come in, they smack up against the bulkhead. Bulkhead does a good job of stopping the area behind it from eroding, but you get a lot of scour right there and resuspension of sediments. And so not great for the water and the areas around that. There's an increase in the number of invasive species associated with these systems. Lots of studies have noted the decline in fish, invertebrate, and marsh bird density. Whether or not terrapins can access these areas. I mean, terrapin, as a good example, need to come on land in order to lay their eggs. And so if you put up a wall, these little turtles just can't get over that wall. Riprap is a little bit better for a lot of these, whereas those green techniques are definitely better. And it's not just local effects too that we've noted for these. It's also important to think that these are additive effects within a broader region. So whether that's within a given distance of a particular location or within the watershed at large. But a lot of studies have documented that once you cross a certain amount of armoring within an area, it's the overall ecosystem services, the diversity of fish, invertebrates, things like that, really starts to drop off. And it's not just what's happening here, but what's happening in the system at large. And those thresholds can be surprisingly small, anything from about 10 to 20% armored within an area is kind of where we see that threshold, where once you go past that amount, you've dramatically modified the ecosystem enough that you see these changes. So these are also preventing the natural migration of habitats with sea level rise, and there's a decline in seagrass resilience in these systems as well. And so one of the things that we need to talk about when we talk about the shoreline armoring is coastal squeeze. And so, like I said, the option for marshes in the area is landward migration. That's really the only way that we're going to maintain aerial extent. And as long as there's nothing behind that salt marsh, and as long as the slope is it's pretty good, those marshes can move backwards. So sea level rises, new areas get wet, turn into marsh. But if you put a seawall or a bulkhead or something behind that, that marsh doesn't have anywhere to go. And so it's going to keep eroding at the front end, and it's going to get squeezed until it's gone. And this can happen, when you put a structure back there, but it also happens when you just move along the shoreline or the landscape and you end up with a higher slope area. So there are natural reasons for coastal squeeze, but a major reason throughout the Mid-Atlantic is human modification of that shoreline. And when that marsh disappears, you lose all of those services that are associated with it. So one of the ways that we have really favored addressing this here in Virginia is through the application of living shorelines. These are typically a marsh sill, and I'll talk a lot more about those in a little bit. But they can be everything from just replanting a shoreline, so vegetating a formerly unvegetated shoreline, to putting down kind of core fiber logs. You could use oyster castles. You could go like this image where you've got a riprap revetment structure, and then a marsh behind it. Bulkheads, or not bulkheads, breakwaters are certainly along this transition of green to gray. But all of these are meant to provide that same level of erosion control by having some sort of structure here. And then also integrating these green structures, these green components, to support ecosystem services. And so a lot of times these living shorelines go in relatively low energy areas. A lot of people only think of these as small tidal creek options. But we've got quite a few examples here in Virginia of living shorelines being implemented on large scale, relatively high energy areas. So this is one right on the James. You can see it's a well-functioning, or it certainly looks like a marsh. Our measurements seem to indicate that it is a pretty well-functioning marsh. And you can see kind of the area around it. If you look at the map, the straight line distance straight across the water is almost 5 miles. And so we're actually looking at maximum fetches for this region of greater than 10 miles. This was a very exposed site. And so even these very green options are still available even in these high energy systems. It takes a little bit more effort, a little fancier engineering to make them happen, but they are possible. And what type of shoreline you put in a given area is, there are lots of tools to help you work through what type of structure is appropriate for your shoreline. And so lots of those tools are out there. And I think, if I'm right, Josh is probably going to talk a little bit about what those options are later today. But one of the things that we wanted to know here in Virginia, living shorelines, when you look at them, it looks like a marsh, it smells like a marsh, but is it a marsh? How similar are those marshes, those living shorelines, to natural marshes? And so we actually did a big 5-year study down here where we looked at lots and lots of different ecosystem services of these living shorelines to see what they were doing relative to nearby natural marshes. So for this study, we defined living shorelines primarily as marsh sills. So we wanted to kind of control the type of living shoreline because we can only survey so many sites. You all are probably familiar with how difficult it is to get site permissions for these big studies. And so we controlled for the type of living shoreline. We focused really on these marsh sills, which really are the most common type that we see here in Virginia. So you get a stone still that is placed channelward of the existing shoreline, and then you grade it, typically do some grading or backfill with clean sand, 10-to-1 slope, put Spartina alterniflora in the low marsh, Spartina patens in the high marsh, and then monitor it to see how it proceeds. So what were the things that we measured? We measured lots and lots of different features. We looked at carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and organic matter in the soils, looked at Spartina alterniflora density. We counted rib mussels, oysters, periwinkles, and burrowing crabs. We looked at several different measures of nectin, everything from fish biomass, diversity, juveniles, shrimp and crabs. We looked at how herons, or these other shorebirds, were using the habitat. And we looked at the overall density of terrapin that were able to use these habitats. We looked at a total of 13 different pairs. So we had different, we had a living shoreline and a natural marsh pair. Each natural marsh was selected to be in very similar physical conditions and very close to its living shoreline pair, trying to compare apples to apples as much as possible. We had a range of ages, everything from a 2-year-old project to a 16-year-old project at the start of sampling in 2018. And these were found across a variety of shorescape settings, everything from urban to rural. So we're really trying to capture where these shorelines are. Are they performing the way that their natural marsh counterparts are? And this is the data, just to kind of give it away. If you look, the white are soils, blue are nectin, green is the Spartina, the gray are the invertebrates, and the yellow are the more terrestrial vertebrates. And if you look at all of them, they are almost identical in their distributions, with the exception of the soils. But if we look a little bit closer at the data, here's what we found. So for the soils at our living shoreline sites, they are still not the same as those at natural marshes, even after 16 years. We used z-scores to assess all of our metrics. So we compared the living shoreline value to the natural marsh. Positive values mean that the living shoreline was better. Negative values indicate that the natural marsh was better. And the relative amount is plus or minus how many standard deviations. And so for carbon, we really saw that these were very low, and we're looking at 0 to 63 years to equivalents for carbon in these systems, 0 to 31 years for equivalents for nitrogen, 0 to 23 years to equivalents for phosphorus, and organic matter was quite low as well. And so part of this is just because of how these systems are built. So in Virginia, we require clean sand fill anytime you create a living shoreline, and that is required. The Corps and VMRC do not want us putting any sort of fines out there, any sort of silt, anything that would get into the water column and increase turbidity and potentially impact seagrasses. And so this is just, when you put in clean sand, it's going to take a while for it to look like marsh mud. That's just how it's going to work. But for pretty much everything else, nectin, if you look at those scores, basically anything less than plus or minus 1 means that it's more or less the same between the living shoreline and natural marsh. Almost all of these metrics were positive, even if only slightly. So living shorelines were as good or possibly maybe slightly better than their living shoreline or than their natural marsh counterparts for all of our fish metrics. For herons and terrapin, pretty much the same. And we're actually seeing, we've done some additional analyses on the bird data since this was published, and we found that there are a couple of species that are actually benefiting from these living shoreline habitats, where we see quite a bit more use of these habitats by, I believe it's green heron and one other species that are really attracted to those rock sills and are thriving in those areas. We've seen terrapin hauling out on the marshes. We see them inside the living shorelines. Everything is really using these habitats the same way. For the plants and invertebrates, basically identical. The one exception is rib mussels. If you look at the entirety of the structure, where you include both the sill, the rock sill itself, and the marsh behind it, mussels are pretty much the same. If you only look at the marsh behind it, we're just not seeing the mussels in the marsh there. It's not quite a big enough z-value to say that it's big, but that's just because they are so darn variable in that area back there. But if you go to these systems, you're really just not seeing very many mussels in those marshes. But we're working on that. I've got a grad student that's starting this fall that's going to try and solve that issue here in Virginia. So overall, this is what all of those metrics look like when you plot the z-scores for each of those sites. And overall, basically identical. I'm slightly negative, but if you look at that standard deviation, no one's going to confuse that for being a big effect. So these are basically identical with the exception of soils. And so A few caveats to this, though, that I'd like to toss out. First, neither all sites nor all metrics were equivalent at the pair level. So all of this is based on, one shoreline versus another. So a living shoreline versus natural marsh pair. And so in one situation, you've got Johns Point versus Tolar. Johns Point was our living shoreline. Tolar was our natural marsh. Johns Point scored way lower than the natural marsh. So that was one site that just did not do as well overall. Counterpoint, Martins was our living shoreline and River Road was our our natural marsh. And the living shoreline looked way better than that natural marsh. These also happen to be the extremes of our Johns Point was the most rural, Martins was the most urban. And so context is dependent. But then even within a pair, so the Wilson's Creek pairs, fish abundance way better at the living shoreline, carbon way worse. And so not every single metric or not every single service is going to be the same for a given project. As far as age, a lot of these are kind of, you build it and assume that it's going to get better with time. And generally that's true. But if you look overall, that's not necessarily what we see. And so these are the actual z-scores for each pair. And then these are the living shoreline ages that they correspond to. And you can see our youngest site on the left had the exact same z-score as one of our oldest sites on the right. So this was definitely a non-significant effect of age. If you really want to force something, you might see this, but you can see it's not a net effect of age. Perhaps at a given pair, you might see that increase over time, but it's not a guarantee that with enough time you're going to be the same. It's just not what we're seeing. And so what can we say? Can living shorelines provide the same levels of ecological function as natural marshes? I think the answer is absolutely yes. Yes, they can. Will every living shoreline provide the same levels of function? Nope. Nope, we can also definitely say that. And then how long will it take a newly constructed living shoreline to reach functional equivalence? That depends. It really, I think the most important take home here is that a lot of this is site specific. Just because you put in a living shoreline doesn't mean you're going to get the same level of function as a natural marsh. It can depend on the features. It can depend on where you've built that living shoreline. If you're putting a living shoreline in a really natural area, somewhere that is relatively untouched, but you're trying to stop some level of erosion or something like that in a fairly natural area, it might take a long time or be very hard for that to mirror what's happening in those natural marshes because they are so generally intact. On the other hand, if you're down in a fairly urban area, somewhere that is very ecologically disturbed, and you put in a living shoreline, you've created a fairly stable habitat in an otherwise degraded area, and that habitat can look considerably better than the natural marshes that are in that same area. And so it's really important to set restoration targets that are appropriate for the project. There probably has to be some standard overall, but exactly what those levels are probably going to be site specific of where we reach something that's functional. So if you want to learn a little bit more about that study, you can check out that paper. You can ask me any questions. And that's really everything I've got for today until the Q&A session. Happy to take any questions then or put it in the chat and I'll get back to you there. So thank you all so much.
Robert, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. I haven't seen a study that looked at multiple living shoreline sites like that before, so that was really interesting information. We do have time for one or two questions, and I saw a couple in the chat. Bill, do you want to come off mute?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that presentation. Yeah, I was just wondering, in Virginia, is it standard practice to backfill sills with sand? And is passive accretion ever used? I was just thinking that it could be part of the issue, right? You have very clean sand for it to build up any, sort of diversity in there. It
Yeah.
seems limited.
Yeah, so if they're building a marsh sill, they're putting in rocks and they're backfilling with clean sand. If they're doing oyster castles, they're probably not going to backfill with sand. Sometimes with oyster bags they will, but generally using oyster bags or oyster castles, those projects, those are where you put them a little bit offshore of where the current edge of that marsh is, and that's where you tend to see that natural backfill. We don't see a whole lot of new marsh establishment in there. That is a very, very, very slow process here in Virginia. Most of the time, it just gets really mucky, soft sediment, intertidal, kind of a mud flat is what we mostly see. We don't see a whole lot of marsh extending out to those structures in the short term.
Got it. Thank you. That's interesting. Thanks.
Yeah.
Dave, you had a great question. Do you want to ask Rob?
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. And Robert, I apologize in advance that I didn't catch the beginning of your talk. So you may have discussed this before I tuned in, but I was curious as to whether there were some obvious differences in the living shoreline techniques that were applied, where some performed better than others. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, so we didn't explicitly analyze any of those for this study. That is something we are looking to address. We've got a proposal out now to really target how those differences may influence. One thing that we are seeing kind of in some of our preliminary analyses is that it's really important to get the length and width combination right in these systems. That if you just put in a really, really narrow fringing marsh, you're not providing enough habitat for those fish. They'll use it, you'll get the fish, but if you want to get the most benefits, you need to also get the right combination of width and length. A really wide marsh that's got a narrow shoreline, you're only allowing so much access. So you need to kind of try and optimize both length and width of these projects to really optimize them for fish habitat.
Great, thanks very much.
Sure.
We'll save other questions till the end of all of our speakers. But thanks again, Rob. That was great information. And we'll have all this recorded, Dave, if you want to check out the beginning of Rob's presentation.
I certainly will.
I think a lot of people will. I know I'm going to probably go back and get some of those literature sightings for some work. But I'd like to introduce our next speaker. It's Dr. Josh Moody. Josh is a research scientist for the Division of Science and Research at New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, and he previously was the restoration manager for partnership at the Delaware Estuary. He will be sharing his expertise on tools and resources for monitoring living shorelines. So take note of some tools that could be useful to you and for this group. And with that, I'll let Josh take it away. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Danielle. And thanks, Rob, for the setup. I'm definitely interested to follow up with you a bit later, Rob, about some of the things you have coming up, and especially the mussels in the back marsh mystery is, for another rib mussel aficionado. That's a pretty interesting question. Are my slides showing all right, Danielle? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, looking perfect.
Okay, great. Well, thanks. And so Danielle asked me to present today a bit on monitoring and tools around living shorelines. So, I've got a agenda here, but I think Robert might have covered some of the intro stuff pretty well. So hopefully we can move through some of that pretty quickly. But quick touching on why we're building living shorelines, the importance of specific goals and designing for goals, why we should monitor and how to monitor. And how to monitor is where I think I'm going to spend probably a good chunk of this time looking at a couple of very specific documents. And then again, Danielle had asked if we looked at some of the tools that support some of the living shoreline efforts, and then winding up with a couple of things New Jersey DEP is currently doing right now around living shorelines. So, to quickly move through, why we might want to build a living shoreline, well, erosion is typically playing a big role in that. In the past, there's been lots of different, hardening types that Robert's touched on. And he also touched on a really important fact that, a living shoreline isn't a particular thing. It's a group of habitats that are working together. And a lot of times, even in restoration communities, we see a lot of these habitats as distinct. There's oyster reefs, there's marshes, there's creeks. But in fact, their health and vitality is going to depend, at least to some degree, on their interconnectivity with the other proximal habitats. And, I feel like this is a concept that's applied a lot more in upland applications, that idea of the habitat mosaic. But it also applies in coastal systems. And, as Robert touched on with some of the great work that they're doing down there, that there's, plenty of research to show a lot of the positives. And although, like Robert pointed out, many times delayed ecological responses to living shoreline efforts, habitats take time to build. And, although they're not, living shorelines aren't really a magic bullet, they can be a good tool to help protect what we have and to build back a bit of what we've lost. So, what is a living shoreline? Robert talked a bit about, down in Virginia, you see a lot of planted sills. And you see a variety of things up here, but I'm going to preface this slide by saying that there's a lot of specific regulatory definitions of living shorelines. In New Jersey, naturally, there's a ton of different perspectives among regions, among organizations, and maybe we'll have some discussions on some of those topics later. Or maybe in another webinar. But I'm going to say that if you're interested in, but unfamiliar with living shorelines, obviously inquire on your associated regulations. But to stay on the subject of monitoring, I'm going to discuss one broad concept that I think is fundamental to all definitions of living shorelines in some capacity. And Robert touched on it earlier. It's that a living shoreline, implies a level of function. You're going to have a problem. You're looking at a place because there's a problem. And because there's a problem, there's going to be something that you want to do about it. And so you're going to do something. You're going to put some sort of materials in place that are going to impact the physical environment. They're going to impact the biological community. That's all going to feed back on itself. And your hope is that there's some sort of positive ecological outcome, which again will feed back to help alter those conditions. And that's really the living component of the shoreline in a couple of ways. Not only is it promoting life, but the living portion is also how these habitats and these subcomponents move and grow and develop, relative to each other. So, but what you're going to have is you are going to have a goal, and that's going to be very important when we think about monitoring. And since you have this problem that you're going to want to correct, you have your explicitly stated goal. In the frameworks I'm going to discuss today's, the goals are generally broken down into a few different categories. Erosion control is always a big one. Habitat protection and restoration, of course, is another one. They touch on water quality benefits, and a new and emerging one that's getting a lot more press recently is certainly carbon sequestration. One thing that we all come to learn over time, and one thing that I first learned from South Park was knowing your goal and what you want to get out of it are kind of the easy parts, but what you're going to do in the middle to achieve that's what can be tough, really nerve-wracking, the most uncertain part of this whole process. So what would be great right here is if someone started talking about exactly how you should define and design living shorelines. But, I think we all know that you can't really, have a recipe for designing living shorelines. Robert talked about appropriate restoration targets in his talk before about, site-specific conditions. And that's something that I think we all know. But there are some things that I think that we can say. When designing for a goal, it is important to remember that landscape perspective to touch back on this. You're going to need to not just look at the shoreline. You're going to have to look around the shoreline to understand what these deficiencies might be. Maybe it's just wave action. Maybe it's not. Maybe there's a variety of other things, hydrologic impacts, biological impacts. We can get back to some of that later, but really, I think a key word besides functional in living shorelines is connectivity. Whether you're talking about a more pristine sort of natural landscape out there, or whether you're talking about an urbanized corridor where you're really having to develop something within a narrow band, you need to connect to those different habitats that are around your target site. And you've got to design with that connectivity in mind. You don't really want to isolate, you want to include. So, how you create that connectivity, it can't really be simplified to a single, standardized technique that spans a whole range of site conditions and features. It is site specific. But there are some documents that can provide some guidance on this, especially John's going to talk a bit about the updated Stevens Living Shoreline Engineering Guidelines, which are, great thinking about designs and needs for site-specific energy. But with ecology, there's just not as much out there, and it's not as easy to give standardized advice. Case studies are great, and there's more and more case studies coming out. They can be really helpful because, as a user, you can go and look at these case studies, and you can find ones that are similar to your site and kind of figure out how to proceed accordingly. But I want to take a minute to mention a new document that's coming out of the Delaware Living Shorelines Committee this year. And it focuses on design considerations for ecological uplift. And this is at techniques and applications of living shoreline projects in Delaware. And, what it really focuses on is it focuses on three main components, design elements, the things that you're going to construct and you're going to put on the ground, offshore structures, a variety of longshore structures, thinking about drainage, thinking about sloping. And it's also going to talk a lot about materials, so sediment, vegetation, core fiber, shell, prefab, rock, wood. It's going to talk about all of these, and then it's going to think about them together. What the document does is it tries to make connections between these different materials, how they can be used in some of these different design elements, and really what that means for feeding back and meeting some goals. One of the nice parts about this document is it does relate material and design elements and their interactive use back to stated goals. And those goals are the ones that are going to align with the monitoring frameworks I'm going to talk about today. So hopefully Allison Rogerson from DNREC Wetland Monitoring Assessment Program can come on soon and provide some more details about that, because it's a really interesting document. It also has a variety of case studies in there that are synthesized and standardized, where they really, start with the goal, they go through the design elements, the material choice, relate those on a project basis, describes the monitoring and how you got to the results, and then again some information on funding, partners, and timelines. It's a really, really nice document that we're looking forward to getting released this year. So, why do we monitor living shorelines? Well, it's how it's working, right? Not just for erosion control goals, but, hopefully for things that have their own ecological benefits, for other important goals, habitat quality, diversity, use. Also, if after installation something's going to go wrong, and, you can ask anybody, something's typically going to go wrong. Monitoring is really how you're going to know. Sometimes things happen quick, and an observation, you can see it. But not all troubles are easily seen or happen really quickly. Ecologies are pretty nuanced, and they take time to develop, and evaluating trajectories and important metrics, it's really your best way to understand if a project is on the path to meeting its goals. So, understanding how these project types develop is really a good way to try to not overpromise results of an intervention, either in magnitude or along, expected timelines. Certain funding streams, may want iterative progress benchmarks achieved, but, ultimately these are very tricky projects, and there's, nothing worse than saying that your project's going to do X in Y amount of time, and then in the last year, you realize it's not really meeting those goals. So that, progressive monitoring really allows for this, adaptive management. You can report the development, and, even if you're not meeting goals, if they're not fully achieved, but you can show a trajectory, and that's going to either provide confidence in a technique's working or a better understanding of why it's not, to help set those project expectations. And that's really key to providing information on choosing the right tactic for the right location. What worked and also what didn't work. Resources are limited, and we have to remember, and it's we all know it theoretically from a science-based perspective coming into this, that negative data is good data too. But it's tough to be on the end of a project that isn't working well. But, if your results can show someone what not to invest, either their time, their money, or their attention in, that's very important. So how can we monitor? Again, there's a lot of guidance documents from a variety of organizations, but I'm going to focus today on just a couple of local ones. And I should say these documents, when they were developed, were aligned with a lot of the other guidance documents available at the time. So the first one is, in 2016, it was, I think, a group of 18 individuals representing, both the public, private, NGO, academic sectors, helped to develop this framework for developing monitoring plans for coastal wetland restoration and living shoreline projects in New Jersey. Now, this was a goal-based framework, so it really asks you to define your goals to understand if you're making progress towards it. And then in 2018, the Delaware Living Shorelines Committee took that New Jersey document and made a few revisions and put out an analog, which made a lot of sense that they would want to do something similar, since the two states are involved in applying similar tactics around a shared natural resource. And both documents have break up your monitoring into 3 different types of goal types: erosion control, water quality goals, and habitat-based goals. Now, the New Jersey document also included hydrologic goals, as well as socioeconomic goals. At the time, Elizabeth Schuster was working for TNC, and she was a really big part of this document, helping people think about how the ecological interventions could also have socioeconomic impacts, which is an often overlooked but really important part of this document. And as we think about updating frameworks and things moving forward, that's a really a good place to touch back on. What's nice about these documents is they're both relatively short. They focus on providing a series of tables really that guide the user through selecting relevant metrics and appropriate methods to help them develop a monitoring plan to feed back and meet their stated goal for, in New Jersey, what project type might be. Because the New Jersey document focuses on 2 project types. There's sort of the platform projects, and then there's the edge projects. But the format's the same, and as are many of the goal-based tables that are in there. I should also mention that both documents are aligned with SMART goals and objectives. Although the New Jersey document doesn't explicitly describe that, there is text describing that alignment in the Delaware document. And Susan Gutierrez from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Delaware is a part of developing that. And so that's, I think, an important part that makes these documents appropriate for a variety of different users. So these are what the tables look like. And I'm going to take a little time to go through these. I apologize for the small text, but there are links throughout this presentation when Danielle provides it to take you to the different documents. You can have a look, and I'm happy to meet at any time if anyone's interested to discuss these. But when you get into the documents, what you have is first your different project types. So this one's for the living shore. This is the living shoreline metric table. It's part of it anyway. There's also the marsh platform, the marsh restoration types. And you have different classes of the different metrics. So there's core metrics that are recommended, and there's conditional metrics. Core metrics are sort of the quote unquote required metrics. They're the ones that are really essential to evaluate for a particular project type. There's also goal-based ones as well. The conditional ones might be a little bit more specific to your project. If you're looking at a project that's supposed to provide habitat for a particular type of organism, obviously you're going to want to monitor that organism. Now, that metric might not be appropriate for all projects, for projects that aren't looking to monitor that, but it's conditional if that is a stated goal of your project. So you have these different metric categories, things that are required or core, things that are supplemental. And then for each one, a variety of different methods are provided, along with user considerations. Now, the user considerations and the method options are what was, pretty important, I think, about putting this document together. And what we tried to do with this back then was provide some methodologies that were going to be suitable for all user groups. A lot of the methods that we're used to doing as professionals, they're expensive and they take time and they're nuanced. The results that come out of them or the data that comes out is difficult to manipulate. And that's fine for high resolution monitoring for those of us doing that type of work. But we all know how hard it is to keep up monitoring sites, especially as we grow the number of sites we have. And having methodologies in there that allow homeowners, environmental groups, people to go out and collect periodic data that's also meaningful, that's informative data, is really important, is going to become more and more necessary as more and more projects go in on the ground, being able to utilize some form of, citizen science to keep up on some of these monitoring tasks. Now, some metrics, it's easy to put like sort of that Home Depot method together than others, but there was a real effort made at the time to try to include those. And also to give people expectations on, what sort of costs might be associated, what sort of technical expertise might be required for different methods related to each particular metric. And then there's the goal-based table. So you have your shoreline type, this could be a marsh platform, it could be a living shoreline, and then there's goals. Erosion control is what this table's looking like, and it shows a couple of the core metrics. Shoreline position is obviously one, elevation of the shoreline, some different options for methods and their user considerations. We've got a habitat biodiversity enhancement goal table here, some core metrics, some conditional metrics, your methodological options and your user consideration. So what a user could do here is a user could go into this document, think about what sort of goals they have, and they can start to put together a monitoring plan. And the text is definitely small on the side, so there's no point in trying to read this. But what I want to point out is some of the differences in the New Jersey and Delaware documents regarding what how the user might interact with them. One of the things that's really important to mention is in the New Jersey document, a few items were provided in the appendices that are of interest. And the first is the methods section. This is 10 pages of links and descriptions of different SOPs for a variety of different monitoring metrics. So there's a lot in there. Of course, it's not comprehensive, but it is really useful, and it's a pretty good starting place to build updates from. And the second is this monitoring plan outline. So this is where a user could come in, they get walked through, defining their goal, where's their project located, what sort of metrics and methods might be appropriate for them, and a table for them to fill out to sort of keep track and organize that. But after this document came out, there was some discussion that some entities already had very specific monitoring plans and reporting structures that they had to abide by. And so although that this is helpful, no one really wants to create a couple different monitoring plans. So since the New Jersey document was already out at that point, there wasn't really much to do. Delaware sort of took it at that point and made some adjustments that we could possibly bring back to this New Jersey document. So in the Delaware update, in that framework, the monitoring plan template, it was left in there for those who might need it, but it was restructured really around 3 tables that were intended to guide the user in thinking about how they're really going to monitor this project to understand its trajectories that can contain all the pertinent info that you are interested in, and that you could fit these into other, monitoring plan and reporting formats. And so the first was a monitoring metric table where, you have your stated goal. There's going to be an objective. This aligns with SMART objectives, the progress that you intend to make. You would choose your metric. You could choose some methods. Maybe you have a variety of different methods for a specific metric. You describe your temporal and spatial resolution. You could think about your analysis question a little bit, and then how you're going to answer that question based on the metrics that you're taking, the data you're going to have in your analysis question. How are you going to look at it? You can organize all of that in one place. Then there's a monitoring timeline table. You can plan out how and when you're going to monitor. And then a progress tracking table where, again, it's got some of the same information like the metrics, but where you can put some of the summary statistics around some of these change in metrics. And, I think for most of us who have had 11th hour emails from different types of managers who need one slide showing exactly what's happened over the last decade on this project, having something in a table like this is pretty nice to have. And also in speaking with groups and people who aren't as familiar with data, this format people have said that they're pretty receptive to it because this progress tracking table doesn't feel as overwhelming. So, turning back to New Jersey, I personally would like to propose, revisiting this document and developing some updates to meet the current needs, and not only the ones outlined in CHARRM's mission that cover a wide variety of resources and include some of the tools that have been being developed, but also in, thinking about some of the different, agencies and partnerships as we're all starting to come together and monitor some of these projects together. Is there some sort of framework that, will fit all of our needs? I think the outline is still pretty solid, but in terms of updates, new project types, obviously shellfish reefs, seagrass beds, there's definitely room to add new project types in there. New goals, especially around carbon sequestration. That's becoming a pretty big topic. We could revisit and update metrics and methods, think about the new tracking tables for New Jersey, and then revisit that alignment with SMART goals and objectives and make sure that that's, as tight as it can be. But, sticking with that, that simple yet sort of thorough way to think about projects is, understanding your goal, choosing relevant metrics, choosing appropriate methods for your project, for your budget, for your skill level, and then, having this monitoring plan that can continually get passed on as projects continue to evolve. So, in thinking about monitoring, Danielle also asked that I discuss some of the tools that are available, around monitoring. So this isn't really too much of a change in direction or a new topic, because ultimately understanding how these projects are working is going to feed back into this decision-making progress. If we want to make database decisions, we're going to have data sources across a wide geographic range. We're going to have some similar metrics, but we're also going to need a way to translate that information in a way that gives us confidence to particular actions in particular places. So tools can be pretty helpful with that, because honestly, on its own, data can seem very overwhelming. We all know how it is on these projects. You end up with lots of data at various resolutions. There's, a bunch of different partners with different tools they want to use and a lot of different opinions. So the question really comes, as a restoration community, how can we start to integrate all that we're learning and all that we're developing into sort of a more, systematic and understandable process, which is, always been sort of the holy grail of this kind of stuff. But it's important to talk about and important to kind of keep making progress towards. So, in order to kind of set this up and touch on some of these tools, I think a lot of you will probably have seen this slide before, either from me or from Rick Lathrop from Rutgers, and because we've been discussing this potential network for a while with a lot of you that are on this presentation and a variety of others. But, I want to simplify things a little bit for this presentation conversation. But generally, I think there's a few questions that are always on our minds when it comes to restoration. Where should we work? What's the problem? What do we need to think about in terms of designs? If we implement something, what's its effect going to be before we do it? And then ultimately, is it working? And, there's been a ton of different efforts to provide information towards these questions, endless meetings to figure out where we're going to work. There's great long-term reference monitoring data that's out there across the state of New Jersey and Delaware. Design considerations, design guidance. Here's cover the Stevens Guide here that we're going to talk about in just a little bit. Project-specific reports on long-term reference data, monitoring data, different design guidance, project-specific reports on tactic results. And, then again, at the end, we have these monitoring frameworks, and honestly, there could be probably a dozen documents under each one of these headers. I just, chose one here for the sake of simplicity. But over the last few years, a variety of different groups have been developing different tools to translate some of this guidance into interactive web-based platforms and calculatory tools. So really what the future goal is to network these tools, to kind of develop a one-stop shop for those looking to use them, to develop some or, some pathway for people looking to develop pathways for projects. So, in the next few slides, I'm going to touch on some of these tools. And as a disclaimer, this is not intended to be a comprehensive description of any of their capabilities or all the things that they include. It's just a quick overview with some links for you to explore later. I'll give you an orientation of the slide layout. But this is kind of a quick view to get everyone's heads around how this vision is currently developing, and then to provide some thoughts and input on it. And I also need to say that most of the tools we're going to talk about today were developed with the help of a lot of organizations and partners, and way more than I'm probably going to point out in any of the slides. The restoration community's really been coming together and working together on a lot of these. I'm just going to mention the primary organizations. I'm trying to mention the primary funding streams, but again, it's just an overview. So visiting the links will help with some of that. So thinking about where we should work. So there is CRAP, the Coastal Ecological Restoration Adaptation Plan. This was led by New Jersey DEP with Rutgers University, American Littoral Society, PDE, New Jersey Baykeeper. We're all part of this work. And it was funded through an EPA Wetland Program Development Grant. And it pretty much primarily has two goals. CRAP intends to be a catalog of both sites and areas that are either of interest or at some stage of restoration. You can think of areas like these polygons in here, and you can think of projects sort of as points, like things that have been implemented at a particular place. The second one is to show spatial extent of a variety of state-identified issues of concern. It shows them independently and as a composite across New Jersey. So there's these, vulnerability layers, these issues of concern, carbon sequestration, where are good areas for that? What about coastal habitat vulnerability, erosion likelihoods, flooding scenarios, coastal storm vulnerability, water quality issues? All of these base layers are in there behind the different areas and the different projects. And by layering these, a user can see what projects and areas of interest might overlap with specific issues of concern, like the wetland degradation, or priorities like areas good for carbon sequestration. And then they can use those either to maybe choose some existing projects that have been nominated to move forward on, or to identify maybe some areas where there's good opportunity to do something, but there really hasn't been projects nominated there yet. Each one of these projects and areas has a lot of background info that you can click on the polygons and see, such as who nominated them, their current condition, the state of the project, any proposed tactics, what stakeholders have been involved. So there's a rollout for this tool. Currently, I think the planning window is for May. Hopefully, hold me to that, but you hear more on it soon, and this will be paired with a webinar to show people how to use it. And so people can, use this for site selection. Where is a place that either needs some work, or if I know I'm going to work in a certain place, what are some goals that I could have for this project? Another one is the Bay Islands Restoration Planner. And that was led by, TNC, Stockton, and the Bay Islands Initiative. I believe it was funded through NIFWIF too. So if you're working, in Barnegat Bay and you're interested in doing some island work, this is a great place to start looking at different things. So this, like CRAP, there's a similar mapping platform in here with all the different islands represented. And there's a variety of both condition and planning metrics that you can use to query different islands here. And you'll notice over here, these are listed in a sidebar along with their data ranges. So you can look for, different islands that might meet a variety of different conditions currently, or that you might have certain goals. You might want something that has close proximity to certain waterways if you're thinking about including, dredged material in it. If you're thinking about bird habitat, you could try to identify islands that are already decent bird nesting sites. And so you can use these different tools to explore these different islands and, again, sort of narrow down that idea of where should I work. So these are the last ones that kind of round out the eye in the sky sort of resolution section. And these are the Living Shoreline and the Marsh Explorers that were led by TNC, developed by Rutgers, but they're really based on the initial Stevens Living Shoreline engineering guidelines as the foundation of it. And, these tools are really great at giving the user a general feel of the overall site conditions, how will fetch and wave action play into decisions around the level of armoring you might need, the types of restoration you're thinking about employing. It's great to give you a really good idea of the energetic conditions that are likely to impact the site or restoration projects. Still needs a little on-the-ground confirmation, but one of the really neat items here is that you can look at a variety of different armoring levels. You can look around the region to see what different techniques might be appropriate for certain areas. But you can also zoom in on certain areas and see, why certain techniques, what different parameters or metrics behind them might make certain techniques or certain levels of armoring more appropriate than others for the area. The Marsh Explorer is really great for getting this landscape view. You can really get a good eye in the sky view of, what sort of dredged lagoons are out there. Again, it has the marsh edge erosion layers, looking at unvegetated marsh, looking at the extent of linear ditching out there. These are really great planning tools. And right now, Rick Lathrop's group at Rutgers is currently working to update these. And I believe that they're moving over to potentially the New Jersey Restores platform. So these tools can help you identify what the problem is. Additionally, once you start getting on the ground, there's tools like WATCH, which is PDE's wetland assessment tool for condition and health. And this was funded first through a New Jersey DEP wetland program development grant, and then through NIFWIF's Delaware Watershed Conservation Fund. And PDE was the lead on it. New Jersey DEP played a big role. Actually, DENREC played a pretty big role too, and a huge TAC committee full of, all the usual suspects in the region contributed in some degree. And what WATCH really does is it provides a framework for users to enter a lot of their higher resolution on the ground data for a variety of different metrics like hydrology, soil condition, water chemistry, vertical and horizontal position, specific biology targets of interest, sediment. These are all listed here. And, when you combine them with the appropriate reference thresholds and thresholds for the different metrics, some of the trajectories from the long-term wetland monitoring data, which I'll touch on in a second, WATCH can provide some info on how well your site's currently doing and how it might likely be doing in the future using the trajectory data to project some of that out. Some new updates to the tool include considerations around spatial sediment accretion, thinking about delivery, platform integrity, and also thinking about soil condition, of your site. And so this typically uses, on the ground quantitative data. It does provide summary outputs in the form of a report. And an interesting part about WATCH is there is a translation of these data. Some of us love these color-coded tables and they mean a lot to us. Other people, again, thinking about that 11th hour manager request, you might want to have a quick bullet pointed translation to sum this up in a couple of sentences, and WATCH provides that too in the summary report as well. Design considerations. So John's certainly going to talk about that in a few minutes. But for thinking outside of engineering for ecology and team building, PDE along with the Philly Water Department, DENREC, New Jersey DEP, and this was funded through PA Coastal Zone Management at first, and then NIFWF again, developed a living shoreline feasibility model. And so there's a really super simple spreadsheet right now that guides the user through collecting some different on-site and a little bit of online stuff like fetch and things like that, online data, and allows them to put it in for up to 5 different sites at a time using like a drop-down menu. So it's all factor levels. Some of the data are quantitative you get, and then it gets binned out. And you pick different factor levels here. And the tool looks at a variety of different physical, ecological metrics. But what's sort of unique about this one is it also looks at site access considerations. And it also looks at community resource and support considerations because, we all know how much site access and community support can really drive a project. So there's a few different outputs are given for your different sites. You can look at these different metric groupings and see how they shake out. It plots them against each other in a few different ways. But really what it's asking, what it's providing to the user is help them consider a lot of the main drivers of degradation up here. And almost who needs to really be on the design team, where you can develop further community support, and what considerations you have around, construction and implementation and monitoring. What kind of some community support options may develop or might you need. For example, in this, we're thinking about design complexity versus implementation complexity here. And so projects that might fall out in here might be relatively easy to design and don't have a lot of access issues, whereas sites up here, you're probably going to want a variety of expertise on them. There are a lot of complicated physical and ecological issues, but also in terms of site access and community support, there might be issues there as well that might make it tough to implement on the ground. And the effects of different tactics, I think for the last tool that we're going to touch on, this is currently being developed by Rutgers, PDE, and New Jersey DEP, this Marsh Future Mapper. And the idea of it is it's going to look at some of the different health indices for a potential site on the landscape broken up by different habitats, where you might have different areas that are doing kind of bad in red, a couple different sub-habitats doing good, like in green. And maybe as a restoration practitioner, you want to change something. You're interested in salt marsh sparrow habitats. You want to raise the elevation here a little bit. You think that's why it's doing poorly. And you've got some information to support that. So you raise its elevation, and how do you know that's really going to work? If you're in an area that is surrounded by other sub-habitats, that might be at certain areas of health, they might be affected. In this example, you may raise the elevation here, but because of erosion issues happening in the low marsh, you're still going to have it's still going to be an effect on this habitat. So in order to really work in this area that you want to work, and you may not only want to have an intervention there, but you may want to pair it with some edge stabilization here, to try to get at the goal. So thinking again about that landscape effect, how will tactics affect the environment, but more importantly, how are conditions in the landscape around your site going to affect the outcomes of your intervention at that site? And I'm just going to take a minute to mention the reference data. These come in and off people's radar, and it's vitally important in determining project trajectories and success. So to get the most out of the monitoring tools, so the New Jersey Tidal Wetland Monitoring Network has been monitoring sets around the area for many years, and these data are becoming available, and they'll hopefully be published by DEP this summer or fall. And then there's the reference wetland database, which was developed a couple of years ago at New Jersey DEP, Penn State, and Riparian, as a way to provide some of this long-term wetland monitoring data by metric, providing some of the statistics for each, data type, and also allowing users to partition the data by, tidal regime, by salinity, things like that. So you can start to think about how tidal wetlands are doing throughout the region and setting trajectories and appropriate goals for your restoration projects. So this is sort of the example of the vision that we could, discuss maybe, the idea of a mapping platform that looks, similar to a lot of the other tools that are out there, but it's got these different individual tools and calculators as buttons on the top of the screen that's going to allow users to kind of toggle between them. And then, a user could, check on certain combinations of base data that is available through some of these specific tools, some other important layers that you have. Reference data would be made available through this platform, the Tidal Wetland Monitoring Network, the Reference Wetland Database. So they can select appropriate reference data for your site, either geographically or ecologically. The different calculators would be available on the side screen, for people to use. And then importantly, there's a download report button where as you do some work through these different tools, your outcomes are saved and they're put together in a report that you can download. So you can generally start thinking about site selection. And if you've got some data, go back, input some of your site-specific data, compare it to some reference data, and start to think about, having a one-stop shop to think about restoration projects, and then using this downloadable report for conversations with different funding entities, with regulatory branches, things of the sort. So just to wrap up real quickly, what is New Jersey DEP doing currently in terms of living shorelines efforts? Well, New Jersey DEP did release the 80 by 50 report, which is really focused on, greenhouse gas reductions and in a variety of ways, including wetlands and aquatic habitats. And really the point is for a 50% reduction relative to 2006 by the year 2030 and an 80% by 2050. And for this, they're setting draft targets for living shorelines and restoration. So thinking about, the draft targets for living shorelines are, a little under 8,000 feet by 2030 and, 10,000 feet by 2050, 70 acres of 2030 for salt marsh restoration, 200 for 2050. So, this is setting targets that the state wants to achieve. And they're also thinking about how they can fund, states thinking about how to fund some of this stuff. So thinking about the Natural Climate Solutions grants, the RGGI funding for blue and green carbon, through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, there was funding made available last year. And a good portion of that went to blue carbon type projects. So projects like living shorelines, restoring tidal flows, vegetation restoration. So thinking about how, we can come together and, plan where to implement these projects, thinking about how the state's going to have some goals for how much of these projects they want to see on the ground and providing funding to get those projects in there. The stage is really set to start moving forward on a lot of the planning that's happening over time. And so, and then a lot of that is going to go to, right back to monitoring. How confident are we going to be that we can propose these projects and we think they're going to start meeting these goals that are outlined, especially goals of funding agencies around blue carbon, and if they're funded through the state, some of the state-specific goals. So, with that, I think I'll wrap up and pass it back to Danielle and John, but hopefully we can have a conversation now or later around, thinking about this cohesive monitoring strategies and how that can be sort of looped into the tools.
Josh, thank you so much. What a great compilation of taking stock on resources and tools and guidance documents, and definitely put updating the New Jersey framework documents as a parking lot item for this group. So thank you so much for all of that. That was excellent. Do we have one question? I think we have time for a question if anyone has one burning in their mind at the moment.
No details were left unsaid, I guess.
I'm sure people will have a lot of questions at the end, but thanks again, Josh. And we appreciate all that. Our next presenter is going to kind of help us delve more into the engineering and the physical environment. We've talked a lot about the biology and the ecology. So we're really lucky to have Dr. John Miller here. He is the director of the Coastal Engineering Research Group at Stevens Institute of Technology, and he led the effort to publish the New Jersey Engineering Guidelines that Josh just mentioned. And his group is monitoring a variety of different living shoreline installations. So we're really lucky to have him come speak to us today. Thank you so much, John. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Danielle. Let's see. All right. I think the slides are up now. Yep. All right.
Looks great. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to talk today about some of the updates that we've made recently to the New Jersey Living Shorelines Engineering Guidelines. Provide a little bit of a history for those of you who might be unfamiliar about what the sort of overall intent of the original document is, and then how we've integrated actually some of what Josh just spoke about into the updates, and then I'll kind of touch on but not get into. We've also created a set of sort of best practices for applying, we'll call them living shorelines principles in more urban or developed environments. So more enhancing sort of the traditional, more traditional sort of grayish infrastructure. Yes, so, okay, so background and purpose. So the Living Shorelines Engineering Guidelines were originally commissioned actually prior to Hurricane Sandy. So I think it was 2011, maybe 2010. So we began working on this set of guidelines with the sort of recognition and understanding that the state wanted to advance the application of living shorelines within the state. Obviously, Hurricane Sandy was a sort of major blow, and it kind of accelerated a lot of things, including the release of our engineering guidelines. The guidelines were intended to sort of be, I would say it's sort of like a playbook, because these projects were relatively new in the state and we didn't have very many consultants that were used to designing these projects. We didn't have regulators used to regulating these types of projects. It really is sort of a playbook to kind of bring everybody together and put everybody sort of on the same, at least starting point, level playing field when considering a living shoreline project from, again, I just want to emphasize the engineering side of things. One of the things that we did want to make sure that we did with our guidelines were to make sure that they were consistent with the Living Shorelines General Permit that was also being worked on at exactly the same time. That was GP 29, but eventually became GP 24. And the intent was, again, just to make sure that things were consistent. We sort of had a head start when we wrote the guidelines. There had been a lot of work prior. I know many of you are familiar, and we just heard a great presentation actually from Virginia. Living shorelines in New Jersey is relatively, I would say now it's maybe it's beyond the toddler stage, not quite at the young adult, teenager kind of stage yet. We're kind of moving forward, but when we started, we were sort of at the infancy stage, and there were other folks that were much more experienced. So we tried to synthesize as much as we could from the great resources that were out there, recognizing that there would be differences in New Jersey versus other locations. Certainly, we wanted to be a little bit conservative when we first started to apply these projects to make sure that we got a good foothold, had a number of successful projects early on so that we could sort of build a little bit of momentum before being as aggressive as maybe other states in terms of implementing projects. So there's differences like that. Differences, we colder climate, so we have we don't quite have as much ice as other folks in the Northeast, but we have more than folks in North Carolina, for example. So some of those factors as well, they're just different locally compared to some of the places where living shorelines have been worked on for some time. The overall approach of the guidelines was a challenge because we didn't want to necessarily take the innovation away from the engineers. So we wanted to allow the freedom and flexibility to apply the best practices in terms of design principles. We didn't want to cut out innovation. So the approach that we took was really to kind of sort of set the stage, identify the factors that were relevant to living shoreline designs, talk about the way in which these factors might be different for a living shoreline project versus traditional engineering project. A great example is tidal datums. Engineers used to working in NAVD and NGVD, not so much used to working with local tidal datums. Obviously, you heard again in that first presentation the importance of datums in terms of where different parts of the marsh will grow. So just kind of relaying that information, putting it into an engineering context, and adding it to the guidelines document. We talk about, for these different parameters that we identify, different ways in which we can assess or determine information about the parameters. This ranges from desktop analyses to instrumentation that we can actually deploy to measure things like wave heights, tidal range, etc. We provided some guidance on alternative selection, and this is you'll see an example in a minute. I want to stress guidance because, as Josh stated, these projects are very diverse, and there is no black and white solution that kind of fits everywhere. So we wanted to emphasize that the siting of these projects is very site specific, but we did want to provide some initial decision-making capability. And then we provided some example applications of how these different site characteristics play into a design. So for example, what does a wave height, what do the wave heights mean to the design of a sill, right? So how do you kind of take that information about the site characteristic? What role does that play in determining things like the crest height of the sill, or maybe the crest width of the sill? How far offshore, things like that. So we kind of add that in as well. So what's new, that was kind of the way the document's set up. It's still kind of set up that way. One of the things that's new is that we've kind of moved away from our original terminology where we define different levels of design. We defined a level 1, 2, 3 level of design. We tried to bring things more into balance with some of the other guidance that's out there. So the Corps of Engineers just released the International Guidelines on Natural and Nature-Based Features in 2022. They have this very complex looking wheel thing you see on the right here. We've borrowed some of the terminology from that. So instead of level 1, 2, 3, we talk about a scoping phase, a planning phase, an implementation phase, and an operations phase. And then we kind of work our guidelines within that sort of overall sort of framework. So one thing that's brand new with this document is the scoping phase. So as Josh did a great job of introducing some of the tools, you see the another wheel diagram here. A lot of these tools were developed after we had released our original set of guidelines. So there was obviously no ability to include them within the guidelines. So in the new document, we've included sort of a scoping phase, which is sort of that preliminary design phase, the phase at which you need only really a limited amount of information about your site that allows you to assess the possibility of applying a nature-based technique, maybe begin to make some decisions about which direction you might go. But once you get through the scoping phase, there's going to have to be sort of a higher level of analysis, right? So it's really almost a screening level tool, and there's a lot of tools that have been developed, which is great, that provide guidance in terms of beginning to consider and think about living shorelines projects. And I just kind of make a emphasis of that second bullet. And Josh, again, he set the stage perfectly because he highlighted this as well. Understanding project objectives and communicating project objectives is critical. And as early on as you can possibly do that, the better. There's nothing worse than getting, months into a project with the client thinking that the living shoreline project on 500 feet of shoreline is going to stop a storm surge from Hurricane Sandy, right? So we don't want to go too far down the road in the design process with these sort of misunderstandings perpetuating. So the second phase, and this is really the phase at which the original guidelines began was what we call the planning phase. Planning phase is sort of your, we call it our base level sort of desktop analysis. This is the level of analysis which allows us to collect sufficient data at our site to be able to generate true conceptual designs and come up with maybe one or two alternatives. These conceptual designs generally consist of proposed layouts, plan views, cross sections, maybe some very rough estimates on quantities and types of materials. This phase is generally, once you get through the planning phase, it's generally the point at which you are probably, and Josh can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is probably the phase where you should be thinking about scheduling a meeting, JPP meeting or something of that nature, to kind of go through your conceptual designs, make sure that you're on track, identify any critical issues before, again, you go too far down that design path, and then have an angry regulator put the kibosh on an extensive amount of work. Within this planning phase, the most critical element really is the site characterization. So what types of things do we need to know about a site in order to effectively design, to do an effective engineering design of a living shoreline project? We kind of break things down into, I think it's 15 site characteristics, grouping them, roughly into these categories: ecological parameters, terrestrial parameters, system parameters, and hydrodynamic parameters. The groupings are not really relevant other than they provide a way to kind of just lump things together. Again, the idea is that at the planning phase, the engineering guidelines provide information about how you would go about assessing each of these different site characteristics at a desktop level before moving into kind of a higher level of analysis, which is really at the implementation phase. So the planning phase, in the updated engineering guidelines, there were a number of changes. Just some examples of how things have changed in the new guidance compared to the old guidance. We've kind of removed the old guidance had storm surge as one of the site characteristics. We've moved away from that, and we talk about storm water levels in this document. It's a more appropriate description of the total elevation of the water at a site. We talk a bit about the importance of understanding the water level with respect to the marsh platform or whatever is behind the project that we're constructing. The real impetus behind this is seeing some designs and some projects that come in and they set the crest elevation of a sill based on the 100-year storm surge water level elevation. Meanwhile, the marsh behind the structure is at an elevation that's like 2 feet above water level. So you have a structure potentially with a crest elevation of 6 feet and a marsh with an elevation of 2 feet. And essentially you're sort of completely over designing your hard portion of your living shoreline project. So we encourage the consideration of more appropriate return periods and design. And within the document, we consider appropriate anything from a 10 to a 50-year return period for most living shorelines projects. Of course, there are exceptions to these. Sea level rise section was updated. The original document was mostly based on guidance from NOAA with some examples of how to do site-specific extreme value analysis to establish things like sea level rise. The new state guidance, the Rutgers staff report, has been adopted by the state. So now that's incorporated into the living shorelines engineering guidelines. And then I guess the last example, erosion history, but this is really indicative of some of the changes that you see throughout. We have really tried to make an effort to incorporate and we call emerging technologies. So the most recent, the most relevant information. So, there's a lot of work that's being done with drones using collecting elevation data, using structure from motion, which really wasn't as popular in 2012 when we were writing the original version. So we incorporated some of that, talk about what it is and how it can be useful for these projects. Satellite-derived observations of shorelines and marsh edge detection. There's a whole sort of thrust out there now in that direction. So I think that's going to be a technology that will develop probably over the next 10 years. So we try to provide sort of what's happening now, and then also, where possible, kind of things that we might want to be aware of, just because that we see them becoming more useful in the engineering design in the future. The project selection guidance that we include within both documents comes in the form of these two tables. The two tables are linked. The first table is qualitative. It talks about three different types of living shoreline project. And it talks about the different types of conditions in terms of the site characteristics for which each is more appropriate. Table 1 is qualitative. Table 2 provides the quantitative, quote unquote, quantitative, call them soft boundaries between the different levels or qualitative qualifier words, basically. And we split it up this way because, again, we wanted to emphasize that the guidance is just that guidance, and that there's not black and white boundaries between the regions of applicability. Some of the updates in the new guidance, several of the thresholds have been modified based on the success of projects that we've seen implemented in New Jersey. One of the easiest examples to look at is the erosion guidance. We originally suggested that the moderate criterion would end at 4 feet per year. This is significantly less than what was being used, I think, in Maryland and Virginia. We selected this sort of lower threshold for moderate, we call moderate erosion, because, again, we originally wanted to be a little bit more conservative to ensure or increase the likelihood of success of projects. So we changed these, and this is all based on projects that have been constructed in New Jersey, but also guidance that exists in the literature. And then we've actually pared down the number of types of projects to 3 from the original 5. And this was at suggestion of DEP. In addition to the site characteristics, there is a section on additional considerations. The additional considerations are the original ones are up here. There were 5. These are things that are not physical characteristics of the site, but that are important considerations when designing a living shoreline project. We've added 2 new additional considerations, and those are adaptive management and beneficial reuse. Specifically, adaptive management, in the future, I think this is going to become more and more important. It's stressed quite strongly in the international guidelines on natural and nature-based features, building projects that are allowed to sort of evolve over time as the conditions change. It prevents over-designing in the short term, applying sea level rise scenarios that we're being conservative and we apply really high sea level rise, but then you have a significantly over-designed project at the beginning, whereas you can kind of potentially design in this adaptive capacity so that you have a project which is effective for the present, but can be modified in the future to account for things that we're a little bit less certain about. Beneficial reuse is another topic which is obviously pretty relevant in the state right now. So where in these projects are the built-in places where beneficial reuse can be considered? The implementation phase is really a phase which this is tackled through talking about different levels of analysis for each of the site characteristics. So once you sort of have a base level desktop analysis of erosion history, what types of tools exist to go out and measure erosion. So the implementation phase, it might be an RTK GPS survey, it might be a drone survey, things like that. In really complicated systems, it might be numerical modeling. So you might do a morphodynamic model, hydrodynamic model of the system to look at different alternatives in terms of structure placement and or sediment placement, not required everywhere, but for some projects it might be. Within our little guidance table, and that's the inset table here at the bottom, the parameters that are highlighted and italicized and boldface, those are the ones that we typically suggest a higher level of analysis for the implementation or final design. So those are the parameters that more significantly affect the character or the success of those types of projects. So it's sort of a guide as to where we might want to do a higher level of analysis. Operations phase really is where we stress things like monitoring and adaptive management. And again, I'm not going to go into this too much because Josh did a great job of talking about the different guidance documents that exist in New Jersey and Delaware. And really, these are things that we lean on. When we talk about this, the only thing is we do really try to emphasize where monitoring can be important for adaptive management. So just kind of bringing those two pieces together. We do have some future updates that are planned. This is actually work that is currently funded. Two different sources. Why are these not incorporated into the current update? Two different sources of funding. So bringing all this together, the new updates that we're working on, there's going to be a user needs assessment. So perhaps you'll get a survey from us at some point. The funding is not completely there yet. One more hurdle at Stevens to overcome. But once that happens, we'll send out a needs assessment. Really, we're updating the engineering specific monitoring guidance. So as Josh just went through, there's a great body of literature out there already. What we really want to focus in on is sort of the structure or the physical aspects or structural aspects associated to the physical functioning and the physical condition of structure of the structural part of the engineering of the Living Shoreline project. So there's stuff out there. COPRI has a waterfront inspection guidance or manual. So we're thinking of it along those lines. So what are the types of things that you're measuring? What are you looking for in terms of assessing the health and function of the engineering part of the Living Shorelines projects? We're going to try to define a simple project, and this was something that came through from DEP. The question is, at what point do you need to bring in a professional engineer? At what point does the project cost skyrocket when you do bring in a professional engineer to design a project? Can we get away with a lower threshold of design for smaller projects, and what does that look like? We're going to expand project-specific guidance, and this is really we took away two different types of Living Shoreline projects from the guidance because they were really not being used all that much. But we do want to kind of now add back in things that we are seeing. So the types of projects specific to New Jersey, but they either are being used in New Jersey or might be used in New Jersey. So we've had people suggest things like WADs is a great example, right? So these proprietary wave attenuating things. Maybe there's a method for bringing some of that back into the guidance. And then the last bullet is the explicit engineering design guidance. And so, whereas originally we didn't think there was enough information to go down this route, I think more and more we're believing that there is information. And really that gets to what are the design formulas that we should be using to think about when we design the crest width and the crest height, the stone size associated with these projects, because we've seen enough of them come in. Some of them basically using what I'll call traditional coastal engineering design formulas, which may or may not be appropriate for Living Shorelines projects. So it's really about trying to provide guidance and point in the right direction. Again, not take complete design control away from the engineers, but really provide sort of a range of different approaches and talk about why they're appropriate and why other ones may not be appropriate, so that we can kind of nudge in the right direction in terms of the explicit engineering design guidance. So just to summarize, the updates, you can read it there. The QR codes will actually just take you directly to the websites, which are the hyperlinks that you see below. So and we'll provide the presentation, obviously. The updates are kind of listed up there. One thing I just did want to touch on, I don't want to take too much time, but the second main bullet there, the Eco Shorelines and Developed Coast Guidance and Best Practices, really that's a corollary document to these engineering guidelines. the overall, the idea is that there's not a strong enough body of literature to fully develop engineering guidelines for these types of projects, but there's enough out there in terms of case studies, examples of successful projects. There is some guidance like the WEDGE, Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines, that focus in the urban environment that we can begin to put together sort of best practices in terms of like enhancing called traditional gray infrastructure in areas that are extremely space constrained. Right? So you have to have that vertical wall. Are there practices that you can use to soften the impact of that, or to try to create or restore some ecological function in an environment which is sort of inherently degraded? And so that document is also available on the DEP website. We have one-pagers that kind of summarize this presentation and some of the updates. And actually, we just published a journal article on the urban guidelines as well. So that information hopefully will get out there and be used. And that's all I have. So thank you. And I should have acknowledged at the beginning my two, Laura Kerr, who helped quite a lot with the guidelines, and Amy Bredis, a PhD student of mine, who also helped with all of these updates.
Awesome. Thank you so much, John. And can't wait to delve more into that document. And am I wrong in thinking that there's an update coming this summer on something, on one of the guidance documents?
Yeah, so the original Living Shorelines guidelines, that document, the update was released in August of last year, and our current funding, which we're just about to start spending, is going to come out. Well, that project expires September 30th, so there'll be an update to the update. And unfortunately, we really tried to sync everything up so there would only be one update. But as I'm sure you're aware, funding cycles didn't match up, and the fact that we don't even have that second set of funding yet kind of shows how difficult it's been. But we finally are there, and we'll incorporate those additional updates and probably release something end of the summer, maybe early fall.
Gotcha. Perfect. Awesome. Thank you. Do we have any questions for John? I have a question. Really interested in that beneficial use addition to the guidelines. Are sandy historical beaches considered in that addition?
It's more sort of it's more at a philosophical level, and it talks a lot about trying to match. I mean, a lot of the work that's being done with the beneficial use learning network and just trying to match up and link up those sources of sediment, which we can't figure out what to do with, and the project. So we talk a little bit about what types of sediment are generally more useful on edges versus marsh platforms, and so it's at a very, very high level. It's not very detailed at all. Another set of funding that we have, that Nature Conservancy is working with Laura Kerr to develop some guidance related to beneficial reuse. So maybe there's a way to kind of link that up and incorporate that into our updated document.
Awesome. Love that. Bill.
Yeah, John, real quick, you said the new guidelines changed from storm surge, I think, to water levels or something. I was just curious as what that means or why.
So it's probably a poor choice of words in the original document, quite frankly. And this goes back to maybe sort of my engineering mindset and kind of trying to match more like physically what we're after. So the reality is we're trying to emphasize that what we're concerned with is really the matching of the water levels. So you have the elevation of your structure, you have the elevation of your water, and you have the elevation of your marsh or whatever happens to be behind it, right? And really it's the water level. That's the thing that's relevant. It doesn't matter whether that water level is created because of high tide or low tide or a small storm. Like, it's really that total water level. So that was really the sort of mental thing that we were trying to emphasize.
Sure. Okay, thanks. Now that makes a lot of sense. Appreciate it.
Can I ask our other speakers to come on camera and we'll open it up for other questions on presentations? I had a question for Rob. I'll kick us off. Rob, you mentioned that living shoreline sites were equal or better for Nectin, and I was wondering if you had theories as to why that might be.
Yeah, so it looks like right off the bat, within about 2 years of colonization, or within about 2 years of planting, Nectin are there in very similar abundances. The vast majority of what we saw at our sites were mummy chugs. Just they're the ones that use the marsh. But even in the fyke nets and in the seine nets that we used to sample those sites, compositions were very similar. There's a good chance that those rock sills are providing some good quality habitat for small fish to hide in even during low tide. So as the marsh drains and all the fish have to move off, there's a good chance that they're still providing habitat with those structures. But then also the shorelines seem to be providing a fair amount of amphipods and other good food substrate for those juvenile fish. So it looks like for all the things that matter for Nectin, that ability to escape up into the intertidal, good structured place to hide during high tide, they all seem to be present fairly quickly after you install a living shoreline.
Kind of makes sense. We used to have all these oyster reefs and seagrass beds in our estuarine systems, and without that habitat heterogeneity, there isn't a lot of like refuge. So maybe some of those structures are fulfilling a niche. Dave, do you have a question?
Yeah, Danielle, I just wanted to follow up on your question with Rob in regards to the monitoring or the sampling that you did, Rob. Did you look at the benthic communities? And again, I didn't catch the very beginning of your presentation, so my apologies.
So the only ones that we directly monitored were mussels, oysters, and burrowing crabs. So not the infauna specifically. A grad student started looking at that, but the composition or the actual analysis took far beyond when she finished her dissertation. And so that data is still sitting somewhere.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, it's great that the fish communities are moving in relatively quickly. It would be also interesting to know how quickly that infauna establishes itself. Thanks.
Yeah. Yep.
I have a question for the whole panel, and I guess we're transitioning to our panel discussion. And Dave's question kind of leads us into it, but I'm wondering what you three each think are the greatest research needs in the field of shoreline protection and living shorelines right now.
There's a go ahead. I'll so I think there's a lot. I think I think a relevant question, and this comes from some of the work that we've done at Gandy's, understanding the role that increased water levels are going to play in the effectiveness of these projects over time. And I'm just speaking from the engineering standpoint. So we've collected some data that indicates that at certain tidal conditions, when the structures are submerged, there is an amplification of wave heights behind the structures. That's obviously a bad thing if the structures are intended to reduce wave energy. So that's one thing that we'd like to know more about. And I still think that structure spacing is something that needs more work. So obviously, providing access or paths for wildlife to move in and out, water to move in and out between structures is important. But what does that sort of ideally look like? I think we have some examples where perhaps the spacing is too big. And we have some examples where the spacing is actually too small or has been closed off, right? So what does the sort of ideal look like? And I don't know that there's some stuff that's been done at VIMS, but it's more bigger breakwaters and less more sill kind of projects. So I think we need to understand a little bit more about that.
Yeah, my thoughts are along the same veins of just long-term resilience of these projects. We're putting them in, we're planting these marshes, but sea level rise is still speeding up. We are still a sediment-starved estuary. How long are these planted marshes still going to be there and persist? What does adaptive management of these living shorelines look like over time? Are we going to need to plan for additional inputs of sediment or raising those rock sills, or what does long-term care and support of these systems actually look like in order for them to continue supporting those services?
Well, I appreciate both of you going first. That's a very, very difficult question, right? Where do you really start? But, I think, and I haven't quite decided if my answer is sort of a cop-out yet or not, but I think we'll see as it goes on. But, I think Robert really described very well the need for, and the benefits of the project-specific monitoring, looking at them on the ground. And, John's concern about, really, we're in a limited amount of space. We have rising seas. What is the longevity of this is definitely on the horizon. So I think I'm going to pop back to my connectivity idea, and that I would like to see more research thinking about this habitat mosaic concept, thinking about how we place projects on the landscape, not in terms of just the project itself, but for its point to be a part of the landscape and to start to transform with the landscape. Is a living shoreline a specific project that's on the ground in a place, or at some point, does it just become part of the landscape around it and provide some sort of transitionatory space, or is it able to move up on land a little bit? What do the conditions around the project site need to be to facilitate some of those positive effects over time? So I think I'll go with that.
A hard question to answer when you have these very developed areas, especially in our state, Josh, but
I wanted to add one more thing. I didn't want to interrupt the others. But one thing that occurred to me, and my PhD student Amy would, absolutely kill me if I didn't mention it. We design all of our sills with a similar cross-sectional geometry where we try to make them as tall and skinny as possible so that the footprint is as small as possible, right? To recreate a natural system. And, we know that crest width is an important consideration in reducing wave energy. So when we see these amplification effects where we start to wonder, perhaps a wider structure might have some benefits that need to be considered, and not just sort of, I'll say, arbitrarily thrown out because we're trying to minimize that footprint. There may be a trade-off with it, which is important to consider in terms of increasing width. And that also provides a window for adaptability. So thinking about adding layers on top of an existing structure to accommodate sea level rise. So that's something I'd like to think a little bit more about too.
yeah, that brings up a really interesting point. The different aspects that really go into how we implement these projects, and sometimes it's not always data driven, but it's also, there's policy, there's resources to consider. I know we're at 3. We always run out of time for discussion with these meetings. But if anyone wants to stay on and ask a couple more questions, I'm willing to keep it open if our speakers are willing to do that.
I'll add one more to what John just said. Just kind of sparked something I think that comes up a lot too, and it's around habitat trade-offs. If there is a lot of consider that goes into minimizing fill, minimizing footprints, And a lot of that has to do with habitat trade-off. And what would be some interesting research to see is that, in certain cases, if you need to have a wider footprint to have a better, physical benefit, is there also certain ecological things you could do that even though you're reducing certain specific habitat quantities, you might be increasing their quality. So certain things like increasing, benthic in fauna that makes, even though there might be a little less fish foraging habitat, is it a better quality? Some looking into, increasing, habitat quality and quantity. How do those balance out within these sites?
Yeah, I think about SAV when you mentioned that, like if we're going to impact SAV in the near term, how can we increase its density in the long term with some of these projects? And yeah, benthic and fauna is another great example. Charmers, you were quiet on the seagrass call. Do we have any questions from the audience for our folks here? One more question, a question or two? Wow, this group was so chatty when we first started, and then we've had these like learning webinars, and I guess our speakers are just so wonderful at covering all the topics that no one has questions. All right. Well, I guess I'll let everyone go. Before we end, I just want to remind everyone of our next webinar. It'll be looking at case studies of living shorelines, and we provided templates for our speakers. So we're going to kind of do like a lightning round, 10-minute lightning round, where folks will cover objectives, lessons learned, methods, like the different things that we outlined from our Jamboards. And then after that, we'll delve more into the novel concepts of living shorelines and talk about some of the concerns or some of the support we have for those tactics. And I'm hoping that we will have at least a 30-minute window for discussion there, and we can kind of summarize everything that we've been talking about for living shorelines at that meeting. I will resend that schedule to everyone. I'll be tapping a lot of you for the upcoming meetings. But with that, thank you for your time. Thank you guys for this wonderful resource. This recording will be put somewhere where not only for CHARRM to use, but others as well, because this is a great compilation of information surrounding living shorelines. We really, really appreciate your time coming here today to talk to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Danielle.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Danielle.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.